And this is Theory of Limits, Part 9. 2. In Islamic legislation that is implicit in Allah's revelation, traditional jurisprudence has sacrificed the universality in favor of their very narrow cultural and nationalist agenda that reflect particular political interests more than they do the universal ethics message of the book. We propose to disentangle Islamic legislation from the narrow cultural perspective of 7th century Arabia and to replace it with a universal perspective which allows cultural diversity beyond the specific legal parameters on the ancient Arabian Peninsula. 3. We treat the Sunnah of Muhammad as a model of good legal practice in the theory of limits, not as the ultimate specification and binding exemplification of Islamic law. Traditional jurists imprison the universal message of Islam too rigidly by their legal injunction derived from Muhammad's Sunnah, thereby mixing Islam with the more specific and much narrower concept of Iman. We suggest to regard the Sunnah as an exemplary method of how to cope with the challenges and legal conflicts that Muhammad faced in his time, and of how to emulate his methods and apply them with our methodology minhaj to a system of law by which we are able to face the challenges of our modern times. 4. We dispense with analogy qiyas as a source of law as a consequence of our quest for universality in Islamic legislation. Traditional jurisprudence is inhibited by this method, which had locked generation of jurists firmly inside the legal and intellectual horizon of 7th century Arabia. The theory of limits functions perfectly well without analogies, which allows mujtahids to be firmly rooted in their contemporary context and to substitute comparisons to early Islam with reference to the latest results of scientific research. This also allows them to correlate Islamic legislation with the epistemological progress in the sciences. 5. We base the theory of limits on the belief that Muhammad's message, Risala, is the last message sent by Allah to human beings. No other new revelation will ever replace Muhammad's message, unlike previous revelations that were meant to be replaced entirely. For this reason, Muhammad's message was not formulated as a final expression of law, but in a way that permits a further evolution of law for millions of years until the coming of the last day. Unforgivably, traditional jurisprudence had regarded Muhammad's message in exactly the same way as previous messengerhoods and treated its law as absolute, certain, and definite. This is a fatal mistake because it has regretfully negated the real essence of Muhammad's message as the last and final revelation, which is by legal and historical logic at odds with absoluteness and comprehensiveness. 6. We take seriously the changes in cultural and social patterns of human behavior and adopt them with our theory of limits. We compare human legislation with a football field where players are allowed to move freely and to use the entire space available. Traditional jurists have been so frightened of unexpected moves and unpredictable developments that they interpreted the rules of the game in such a rigid way that players were only allowed to move on the sidelines of the field, which inevitably led to a complete paralysis of the game. Put in the legal terms, we would allow flexibility in moving across the entire field of legislation, encouraging creative moves that lead to great social-cultural diversity in regulating marriages, divorce, inheritance, theft, murder, adultery, polygamy, dress codes, and so on, provided that legislators and mujtahids always stay strictly within the limits that Allah has laid out in the book. 7. We distinguish between 3 branches, furu', of Muhammad's message, which only one allows the practice of ijtihad. Ijtihad will never be allowed in the sphere of rituals, since alterations will be rejected as harmful and illegitimate innovations, bid'ah. The same is true for ethics and moral ideals, since the divine condemnation of hatred, greed, dishonesty, gluttony, and such must never be modified or changed. In the third branch, that is the legal sphere, the legislative verse of command, do, and prohibition, do not, permit the exercise of ijtihad. However, traditional fiqh jurisprudence, obsessed with an almost pathological quest for ritual accuracy, has ignored the ethical sphere, blocked ijtihad in new legislation, and instead dealt with smallest and most insignificant details of ritual behavior. Our theory of limits put the priorities right and allows ijtihad for all legal verses, whether explicit nas text or not, and retrieves the ethical underpinning of Islamic law that is once undoubtedly had. Finally, we believe that the theory of limits functions. 8. Without the need to resort to abrogations, in our view, the abrogation of legal verses within one and the same messengerhood never took place. Nasikh wal mansukh. If verses were abrogated, then this was only between subsequent messengerhoods, for example, between Moses and Muhammad, as explained previously. This implies that a new messengerhood could either amend or completely annul an earlier messengerhood, or, if no legal provision was given, introduce an entirely new rule. Traditional fiqh has, on the contrary, been based on the acceptance of abrogation within messengerhoods, assuming wrongly that the following two verses supported their false views. None of our revelations do we abrogate or cause to be forgotten, but we substitute something better or similar. Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 106. When we substitute one revelation for another, and God knows best what He reveals in stages. Surah An-Nahl, verse 101. We believe that both verses refer only to the abrogation of divine messages as whole, not individual sentences of the divine text. This is based on our belief that Allah would not issue contradictory legislation within one and the same messengerhood, whatever the historical situation. We believe in a succession of messages that are naturally replaced by a new one, a new revelation. Thus, we see ourselves today in a wholly new post-prophetic age in which, although formed and shaped by previous messengerhoods, we have matured to such a degree that we can be left alone to sort out legal problems without further divine messages. As we have showed, Allah has urged us unambiguously not to wait for new revelations, but to rely on reason in using what we have already been given. Thank you for following Theory of Limits, Part 9 and final part. Political Islam is next. Let us hear your thoughts.